A single candle flickers, low in the hushed cavern of awareness, and its flame reveals a truth that trembles on the lip of consciousness. To desire is already to suffer. Every longing drags the heart into night. Every hope unveils absence. In that silent ignition, the viewer's mind still sand in the stillness, awareness begins. To exist is to bear a stubborn ache, a craving that rises like tidewater against rocky shores. We strain toward elusive forms: love, success, belonging, each one promised to ease the void, yet each, like mist, dissipates upon grasping. Desire, the cruel architect of suffering, lays brick upon brick in the unquiet soul. We chase the ephemeral, mistaking the pursuit for meaning. This is the first release, recognizing how the will deceives us, that every ambition is an echo of emptiness within, and that the world's glitter is a hall of mirrors masking absence. We walk on footsteps, echoing in the caverns of yearning. Modern illusions parade before us like carnival lights. The digital self, the curated life, the currency of constant achievement. We click and scroll, hoping the next update will whisper, "Here, now, you are sufficient." But nothing stills the ache. Each notification glows and fades, like comets promising new light, leaving darkness unaltered. In this revelation, we sense the next moment of relief, the recognition that our frantic seeking is itself the chains binding the soul. We descend further, guided by a lantern of quiet introspection. The world's noise falls behind. We identify the subtle contract we've made with suffering, that pleasure begets pain, that joy is mirrored by sorrow, that refusing discomfort is refusing life. Our culture, enamored of comfort, shields us from the rawness of reality, yet reality does not negotiate. The will aches, even masked by security. To feel pain, to confront it, is not failing it, is remembering the texture of being. And so we taste the relief that arises when comfort dissolves into awareness. In the cool hush, we meet illusion, the self as hero, deserving, perpetual. We cherish our projections of strength, of hope, of redemption, but these idols fracture under scrutiny. We awaken to the disquiet that lurks beneath pride and purpose, the hidden belief that desire can fill the vastness of absence. The will whisper, "Just one more." But the philosopher of shadow reminds us, the cycle renews the ache. To break free is no heroic leap, but a quiet refusal to feed illusion. And here, in this refusal, we taste liberation and emotional release, born not of joy, but of clarity. We linger in that space, neither lifted nor ruined, only aware. We sense the futility of labeling this path. Enlightenment, for language itself, dims the flame. There are only breaths, moments when the will softens its grip and the mirror reveals its reflections without commentary. The heart, still throbbing, experiences the serenity of non-grasping. In this stillness, suffering remains, but it is no longer a wound demanding healing. It is just suffering, naked, like an untouched surface of black water holding the sky. The candle near its end flickers more brightly, the paradox of its own demise. We realize that in surrender not to hope or bliss, but to the simple fact of existence, we transcend the demands of desire. Not by extinguishing all longing, but by perceiving its nature. We watch the wheels rise and ebb, like distant storms over the ocean, without being drowned in them. Awareness becomes the lone lantern, lighting our Passagino promise-laden, not victory, declared, only steady in its honesty. The final glow scents the air with clarity. No calls to action, no prescriptions, only the quiet statement that to observe desire is already to step outside its coil. The self remains, but stripped of sovereignty. We are witnesses, not warriors. We are shadows beneath truth's pale moonlight. In that mirror, the viewer sees suffering not as failing, but as the deepest root to lucid self-awareness. The candle gutters, and with that dying light, we do not celebrate or mourn. We only lean into stillness, and know that in the dissolution of illusion, the soul, lost and hungry, touches its own reflection and disappears. The air thickens with the scent of fading will, and in that density, thought slows until it no longer seeks escape. Suffering is not the aberration, it is the thread from which our inner fabric is woven. To recall from pain is to recall from the very shape of existence. Joy is but a pause in the relentless machinery of longing, a shimmer on the blade. Even happiness, so often worshipped, reveals itself as a flickering deviation, not a foundation. It cannot stay, not because we are unworthy, but because its very nature is transitoria phantom with no home. The veil grows thin. We begin to see how the world, once vibrant with promises, is a stage of mirrored illusions. The career, the lover, the accolade each offers the mirage of completion, yet all fall away, revealing the gnawing incompleteness they once concealed. The will, ceaseless and blind, knows no rest, only redirection. It leaps from object to object, as a starving moth flutters toward every flicker. And so the game continues not because we are evil or broken, but because we are ensnared in a mechanism that feeds on its own emptiness. Even the self, so central in the grand performance, begins to dissolve under scrutiny. What we call I is no monolith, but a ripply surface agitation over deeper waters. Personality, identity, dreams, these are costumes worn by something far less stable. In moments of true stillness, we see it. The self is not a sovereign, but a servant to the will, a puppet animated by silent commands. And once this is seen, the grip begins to loosen, not through resistance, but through quiet seeing. The detachment is not an act of violence, but of compassion for the truth. In detachment there is no grand epiphany, no chorus of light only, the slow cooling of fever, the gentle release of clenched hands. One no longer demands that life conform to the ache within. One merely watches the ache unfold, without amplifying its cry. It is not peace in the way the world defines it, but something stranger, more austeria, stillness that neither seeks nor flees. Here one finds not joy, but the absence of torment in no longer chasing joy. To see through illusion is to walk among ruins. The temples of meaning collapse, the statues of purpose crumble, but in that desolation, a peculiar beauty emerges. Not the beauty of form or triumph, but the stark grace of exposure. The bones of truth lie bare, and they do not tremble. There is no narrative here, no ascendantly being, raw and unscripted. And in this rawness, suffering is no longer something to cure, but to behold. It is the fire that clarifies. The world continues, indifferent and vast. Others run still, arms outstretched for mirages. They must, for the will is not easily stilled by insight. But for the one who sees, even briefly, there is nothing left to pursue. One walks not to arrive, but to remain. One speaks not to persuade, but to echo the silence. And so the path deepens not forward, but inward. The rain falls with no purpose, no intention, only the inevitability of gravity pulling droplets toward dissolution. So too does the human spirit descend not as punishment, but as necessity. The will drags us downward, not to destroy, but to reveal. In the descent, illusion burns away like mist under morning fire, and once all else is stripped, the ambitions, the attachments, the fleeting highs, what remains is neither despair nor hope, but the undressed truth of being, that we are vessels of longing, endlessly refilled by the same drought. Look closely, and you will see that no pleasure exists without its shadow. The momentary satisfaction of a desire only marks the birth of a new one, like waves perpetually rebirthing themselves on a shore they can never claim. To desire is to enter a contract with suffering one that cannot be negotiated, only understood. The modern world, with its synthetic lights and endless distractions, only decorates the prison. It does not open the door. The pursuit of comfort, of productivity, of recognition, these are ornaments on the bars of our cage. The tragedy of life lies not in what we lose, but in what we endlessly seek. We seek as though we were once whole, as though something were taken from us and must now be restored. But the original condition was never wholeness. We emerge from lack, not into it. From the first breath, we cry not because the world wounds us, but because the soul recognizes that to exist is to hunger. This is not a flaw in design. This is the design. To detach is not to become cold. It is to burn without illusion. It is the slow surrender of investment in what does not and cannot last. The face of beauty fades. The achievements are forgotten. The loved ones pass through time like figures in a dream, yet we cling because the will cannot accept impermanence. It calls impermanence a threat and death an enemy. But the one who sees clearly no longer resists. They become a witness to transience, and in that witnessing, they find a serenity untouched by outcome. There is no cure for the human condition, no salve for the restless will. There is only the softening that comes with understanding. The fire continues to burn, but one no longer throws oneself into it. One sits beside it, watching its movements, recognizing the patterns. Hunger rises, pain follows. A flicker of joy appears, then vanishes. This is the rhythm, this is the music. And in no longer dancing to its every note, we begin to hear the silence beneath it all. The silence, this is what remains when desire goes quiet. Not absence, not emptiness, but stillness. A stillness that does not promise anything, does not reward or punish, but simply holds. The world, in its rawest form, offers nothing and demands nothing. It is only we who bring expectation, who paint futures upon the void. When those expectations fall away, the void no longer frightens. It becomes vast, yes, but also strangely familiar. It is not death that terrifies us, but the absence of narrative. We do not fear ceasing to be, but ceasing to become, yet all becoming ends. The arc of a life bends not toward triumph, but toward stillness. The breath slows, the gaze softens, the will finally stutters. And in that stuttering, we glimpse freedom not as escape, but as the vanishing of the one who needed escape. The illusion of control, of destiny, of meaning as an external gift, these dissolve in time. What remains is not nihilism, but lucidity, a clear seeing that no longer demands the world be different. Suffering persists, but it no longer owns us. Pleasure comes and we let it pass. In both, we are grounded not in the content of the moment, but in the awareness that holds it. And so we drift not upward, not onward, but inward, into the silence that has always been there, beneath the noise of want. The silence does not speak, but it listens. It does not shine, but it reveals. And in its depths, we no longer ask to be delivered. We only watch the light go out, and with it, the need to burn. The wind moves through the trees without asking, without needing. It is not burdened by identity or direction. It brushes past the world as the quiet embodiment of freedom not defined by choice, but by the absence of craving. And so we begin to understand. Liberation is not an act of breaking chains, but of ceasing to pull against them. The will insists that we must act, that we must shape and conquer, but beneath its incessant pressure lies the possibility of non-resistencia, life not of ambition, but of perception. Pain, once seen without narrative, loses its sting. It remains, but it does not possess. We begin to sense that suffering intensifies in proportion to the stories we weave around it. This should not be. I must overcome. Why me? These are the refrains that magnify pain into torment. But if we sit with the rawness, without ornament, we find something else. A cold purity. Suffering is no longer personal, it is universal. It is not punishment, but principle. Like gravity, it simply is. And in recognizing this, a strange peace enters our peace, born not of resolution, but of surrender. Illusion begins with the promise of wholeness. The world suggests there is something out there, something or someone that will complete us. It decorates that promise with language, with imagery, with the dreams of 1,000 poets who have not yet seen the scaffolding fall. But the moment we attain, we discover the hollowness, not because the object failed, but because the will moved on. That is its essence. It cannot linger in satisfaction. It is the ceaseless craving for the next horizon. And thus, satisfaction becomes a fleeting pause in a journey with no destination. Modernity sharpens this hunger into spectacle. It does not merely offer illusions, it manufactures them at scale. Social validation becomes currency, and visibility substitutes for worth. We are not asked to be, but to perform. And so the self fractures, becoming image, becoming product, becoming stranger to itself. But beneath the digital glare, the same cry persists. See me, approve of me, make me real. The tragedy is not that we ask, but that we believe such affirmation can silence the primordial wound. To detach is not to renounce the world, it is to see it without enchantment. The sunset still moves us, the child's laughter still stirs, but we no longer confuse these flickers with permanence. We taste beauty with the awareness that it cannot last, and in that awareness, we begin to appreciate it not more, but differently, no longer as possession, but as passing light. The attempt to hold beauty is what breaks it. The hand that closes on flame cannot help but be burned. The soul that sees through illusion ceases to demand meaning from the outside. It stops asking life to justify itself. Instead, it begins to observe quietly, steadily, the rhythm of arising and fading. The seasons do not protest their cycle. They do not argue against winter, nor cling to spring. And so, we too may learn to move without resistance, not as passive observers, but as lucid participants in a world that owes us nothing, and yet offers everything if we stop insisting it fulfill our dreams. The dream of control, of mastery, dies hard. We are taught that to live well is to shape fate, to steer the ship. But we are not captains. We are passengers, held by tides, far older than thought. The wise do not wrestle the sea, they float upon it, eyes open, breath slow. There is no destination to rush toward. Every port fades, every compass lies. Only the moment remains, and even that, barely. And when we finally seize our striving not in despair, but in recognition, we come to rest, not in solutions, but in stillness, not in the absence of suffering, but in the absence of illusion. The self, so long defended, begins to dissolve. Its edges blur, its center hollows, and from that hollow, a deeper silence emerges, silence that asks nothing, needs nothing, promises nothing, it simply is. And in that isness, we vanish, not into loss, but into what was always waiting behind the veil. The body ages even as the mind pretends it does not. Each moment is a shedding, an imperceptible erosion. The flesh, once filled with vitality, softens into decay. The eyes, once wide with the mirage of future, begin to dim with the weight of repetition. Time does not pass its peals. Slowly, deliberately, it strips from us all borrowed illusions. Youth, beauty, strength, even memory, all slide from the frame like dust shaken from old cloth. And yet, we are taught to fight this current, to paint joy over disintegration, to smile as if we do not feel the quiet horror of vanishing. To awaken is to no longer flee this erosion, but to bow to it. To understand that life is not a story of accumulation, but of loss. What we call growing older is in truth a slow unmasking, a gentle theft of every ornament we mistook for essence. The face that gazes back from the mirror becomes unfamiliar, not because it has changed, but because the gaze itself begins to deepen. It no longer seeks the self in contour or color. It searches the silence behind the eyes, and begins, perhaps for the first time, to recognize the stranger who has always watched from within. In the weariness of this recognition, a new clarity arrives. Not the sharpness of youth's ambition, but the softened focus of one who has ceased to reach. Life no longer appears as a field of choices, but as a procession of inevitabilities. What once felt like freedom is revealed as compulsion. The marriage, the career, the house, the children all arrived not from sovereignty, but from submission to inherited longing. We choose not freely, but predictably. We repeat desires whispered to us before we could speak. The will does not consult us, it only moves through us, a silent monarch in the body's throne. Suffering sharpens this truth. When pain floods the body or the heart, it washes away illusion. In its presence, we no longer care for the mask, for the roles, for the theater of becoming. All that remains is the naked self, trembling beneath the weight of being. And in that trembling, we glimpse what we truly are. Not warriors, not lovers, not architects of destiny, but vessels open, fragile, finite. The proud constructions of self cannot survive agony. They crumble into what they always were, defenses against the knowledge of our own emptiness. Yet it is within this emptiness that something unspoken stirs, not meaning, not hope, but awareness, pure, untethered, and sober. Awareness that does not strive, that does not need to be redeemed. It merely sees, and in seeing, it breaks the cycle of reaction. The one who suffers consciously no longer adds narrative to pain. They do not ask why, nor do they pray for rescue. They abide. They allow the wound to remain a wound without becoming identity. And in this allowance, suffering no longer multiplies it, simply breathes. The world continues to spin, oblivious. Empires rise and fall. Lovers meet and part. Children are born into a machine that hungers for their dreams. And through it all, the silent observer watches. This observer is not separate. From youth is what remains when the rest has failed. It does not speak in words. It does not comfort, but it endures. And in its endurance, it offers a peculiar companionship. The knowledge that you are not your striving, not your roles, not even your pain. You are what sees. This seeing is not transcendence. It is not the high seat of divinity. It is the ground. It is what remains when all else has crumbled. And in that ground, one begins to move differently, not with urgency, but with quiet precision. Actions no longer aim to alter the world, but to reflect its nature. Words no longer seek to persuade, but to mirror. Silence becomes preferable, not because there is nothing to say, but because the soul no longer confuses speaking with understanding. As death draws closer, and it is always close, we feel the last veil lifting, not as terror, but as inevitability. The will that once roared now whimpers. The ambitions grow quiet, even memory begins to slip through the fingers. And in this dissolution, a final truth appears. We do not live in order to become, we live in order to vanish. Life is not a stage for glory, but a corridor through which we pass, touching briefly the mystery before returning to it. And so we sit at the edge not with dread, but with clarity. We do not ask for more time. We do not beg for one last illusion. We simply exhale the need to be, and in that exhale, we find what the will could never offer: rest. Not sleep, not numbness, but the rest that comes when there is nothing left to hold, nothing left to fear, and no self left to preserve. Only the echo of existence remains unclaimed, unburdened, and finally still. There is a moment in every life, silent and unsought, when one turns inward, not out of choice, but out of the exhaustion of hope. All things promised have arrived and crumbled. The pleasures tasted have withered into repetition. The joys, if they ever were, recede like voices down a long, empty corridor. And it is then that one no longer asks, "What will I become?" but instead whispers, "What remains when becoming ends?" The self, once inflated with dreams and declarations, begins to contract, until it is no more than a breath unclenched, anonymous, observing. To be human is to carry the illusion of importance, like a crown of thorns. We imagine ourselves central, necessary, indispensable to some vast design, but the universe neither knows nor notices us. It unfolds with cold indifference, the same whether we triumph or fall. And this is not cruelty, is liberation. For once we release the notion that our suffering is special, we step outside the theater of self. We begin to see life not as ours, but as an impersonal stream in which we briefly appear, foam rising and falling, not knowing why. From this vantage, morality loses its glow, not because evil becomes good or right collapses into wrong, but because the entire scaffolding of judgment proves hollow. We do not act from free will, we are moved by necessity, by impulse, by forces older than thought. The murderer and the saint obey the same will, cloaked in different circumstances. Responsibility, that proud invention of the self, evaporates when the self is seen clearly. A transient formation, reacting, surviving, believing it chooses. The guilt we carry, the pride we feed, both arise from the fiction of autonomy. In solitude, these truths settle like ash on the skin. One walks more slowly, one speaks with less urgency. For what is there to defend? What remains to achieve? The world hums with the same suffering, wrapped in new garments. Technology, ideology, progress. These are not escapes from despair, but merely its distractions. The human heart, unchanged since the dawn of will, aches just as it always has, crying for what it cannot name, chasing ghosts it calls salvation. And in this endless pursuit, all relationships falter. We do not love out of abundance, but out of need. The beloved is not seen, but used as a mirror to reflect back a tolerable self. Romance, family, friendship each begins as longing cloaked in affection, and too often ends in disappointment once the illusion thins. We do not fail each other out of malice, but because no person can complete what is structurally incomplete. The soul does not need companionship, it needs silence. Only in solitude does one cease to extract from the other and begin to see without grasping. This is the beginning of detachment, not asceticism, not withdrawal, but the quiet ceasing of demand. One no longer prays for peace, one no longer fights for joy. These were always mirages painted on the wall of time. True detachment is not numbness, it is lucidity. It is seeing the nature of things and choosing not to interfere. The tree does not weep when its leaves fall. The river does not resist its course. And so, too, the soul begins to move without friction, letting go not through effort, but through understanding. Death, which once loomed like a threat, becomes a companion, not feared, not welcomed, simply understood. It is not an interruption, but a continuation of what has always been dissolving. Every breath is already a preparation for the last. Every goodbye rehearses the final departure. To live fully is not to resist death, but to integrate it, walk beside it, to know its silence, to let it teach the art of leaving gently. When the time comes, it is not the end, but the vanishing of the questioner. The riddle ends not in a solution, but in the disappearance of the one who asks. And what follows? Nothing. And that nothing is not darkness, but the absence of need for light. It is not sorrow, but the end of the one who sorrows. We return to what we never left, for we were never separate, only dreaming of identity. The self unwinds, and with it the suffering born of division. What remains is not known, cannot be known, for knowing requires separation. What remains is the stillness before will, the silence beyond language. It is not peace, because peace implies conflict resolved. It is the absence of all conflict, of all resolution, of all seeking. And this is the end of desire, not a final act, but a slow dimming, like twilight fading into night. No applause, no revelation, just a quiet cessation of grasping, the hands falling open, the eyes turning inward, until even vision dissolves. The journey ends, not in a place, but in the relinquishing of the one who travels. And in that vanishing, the final illusion falls away, and there is no longer anything to attain, nor anyone to attain it. Only the silence, only the breath, only the disappearing. The world fades like the final notes of a forgotten melody, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. Everything that was urgent now drifts, untethered. The past loses its shape, and the future dissolves before it can arrive. Even the present, once clutched like a talisman against the terror of emptiness, begins to loosen. The pulse slows. The inner voice, once so loud with demand and commentary, falls into silence. The self, that brittle edifice of accumulated longing, collapses not with a scream, but with a breath that does not return. We see now that all effort was a gesture in shadow, that the hands reaching outward were only trying to touch themselves. Every cry for love, for meaning, for permanence each, was the echo of a deeper cry. The will, clawing at the silence, desperate to exist forever. But the silence waits, it does not argue, it does not persuade. It only remains patient and vast, like the night sky over a forgotten field. And into that sky, the soul dissolves, not shattered, not lifted, but absorbed. There is no judgment, no reckoning, no celestial arithmetic tallying joy and sorrow. These were the inventions of minds that could not bear the absence of narrative. In truth, there is no story, only movement, and then stillness, only longing, and then its cessation. What seemed once to be a self was only the flicker of will caught in the net of sensation. When the flickering ends, nothing is lost. The flame returns to the dark from which it came. The dark is not evil, it is the unspoken. It is peace without a witness. All words fail here, even these, which have led to the edge, now begin to fall away. Language was always too crude to hold the truth, It broke beauty into names, sorrow into reasons, silence into concepts. But now the final silence arrives, and it asks nothing. Not comprehension, not gratitude, not surrender. Only that we stop pretending there is something left to become. The illusion ends when there is no longer anyone to maintain it. And so, the last veil falls. The dream concludes. The will, forever hungry, forever restless, releases its grip. What remains is not peace, but the end of the one who needed peace. Not transcendence, but the collapse of the one who sought to transcend. Not salvation, but the disappearance of the one who feared being lost. This is the final truth, that to exist is to suffer, and to see is to let go. Nothing more, nothing after, just the stillness, the breath, the vanishing. The light that once burned with longing fades. And in the dark that follows, there is nothing and no one to call it dark.